Hi, I'm Hazal. Welcome. I decided to pre-record my presentation because I will be sharing a lot of videos with you. And I want to make sure that there is no technical glitch. I am not very good with sophisticated technical stuff when it comes to presentation, going in and out of videos. So I just wanted to make sure that things are technically safe. I will be watching this presentation with you on the day it will be shown. So at the end of the presentation, if you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer if I can. Let me give you a summary about the presentation. I will explore grief. I will explore it personally, artistically, and as a therapist. Personally, I came to define the process of grief as repeated cycles of shock, surrendering, solace. And I will talk about those three stages. Artistically, I will describe art making as the container of the grief process. I will talk about grieving as a process of listening, being, and allowing expression. I will share musical pieces I composed, arranged, and sang, and some of the pieces also have the lyrics I wrote. I also made videos, so that's why I wanted to pre-record. I wanted to make sure that the videos reach you safely. And as a therapist, I will talk about grief from the point of neuroscience. I will reflect on the process of being both the therapist and client at the same time. And I will reflect also on the difference between talk therapy and therapy using the arts in grieving. Maybe not so much the difference, but how they may complement each other, and what is the difference in a way that at which stage might talk therapy be maybe more useful than therapy with the arts. Of course, it's subjective, but I will reflect on both. And I will share two brief case examples, and those case examples are really about my capacity to be with grief, with my client's grief. And one case example will be before and the other one after my own grief process. So let's start with the description of grief. What is grief? Deep pain caused by loss. And it's also a sense of being lost, not only as a result of loss of a loved one, but loss of a dream, loss of health, could be loss of relationship, loss of safety, loss of home, loss of country, loss of identity connected to a relationship, loss of a career, a place, a way of being, loss of ability. The kind of grief I want to talk about here is the loss of a loved one due to death. And when it comes to loss of a loved one, how loss occurred may add complexity to the grief process. Was it suddenly? Was it over time? Did you get to say goodbye? Was it due to old age, due to an illness? Was it during childbirth? Or was it an accident, suicide, murder, war? And why am I talking about grief? I lost my father suddenly November 5th, 2020. He had some health problems, but they were not diagnosed as fatal. The day of his death, I had spoken with him 10 hours before. It was my morning and it was his early evening and everything was fine. He was home. His voice sounded very pleasant. But 10 hours later, I read in an email, in a condolence message, that he passed away. He had a stroke and died. I could not travel to my home country due to the pandemic, and that is how I found myself deep in grief in the state of Washington because there were so many fires in California. This is not the first time I went through grief, but this is the first time I went through grief personally, artistically, and as a therapist all at once. And that is why I thought sharing it in this context might have some value. There's also another detail, important detail. My father was a musician, and I began learning the language of music since I was a baby, just by being with him because he was composing at home when my mother was working. And as I grew up, I sang with him, I attended his music theory classes, I worked with him on various musical projects, but I never composed, I never arranged. That was his job. My passion was singing. So this is my father. I want to share now a video with you. This is from a concert. We are both singing a song. This is from the year 1999. This was recorded by someone who was sitting in the audience.
Yılmaz Onay'ın Ankara Sanat Tiyatrosu için yazdığı bir oyundan bu şarkımız. Nereye koysam ellerimi. Hazal'la birlikte seslendireceğiz. Evet Arzu Halcığım, başla. Kaleminden kan damlıyor Arzu Halcığım. Nereye koysam ellerimi. Yanıma mı, önüme mi? Sallayıversen ya da büzülsen, olmaz hayır düşünmeli.
Unutsam ne olur şu elleri, İşte böyle attım gitti. Oh be ne rahat, tarafsız hayat. Keyfine bak, yan gel de yat.
Elleyip geçmek şakası yok. İyi kullan, düşmanı çok. El var öldürür, degah, el var güldürür. Çözüm sende, elinden kork.
Tertemiz sanat ellerimiz, pis ihanet ellerimiz. Kahraman biziz, zavallı da biz. Hangisinde ellerimiz?
Eller düşman maşasıdır. Satar sizi dolandırır. Eller haktır, eller halktır. Elim seçmek zamanıdır.
Nereye koysam ellerimi, kalem kırsam çeksem ipi, ya da tersine sarıl kaleme, kalem yapan da el değil mi? Çıktık hayat sahnesine, kafamızla sesimizle.
What is grieving? Grieving is the process of dealing with loss. Grieving is about dealing with absence itself. No longer being able to locate the loved one physically is extremely disorienting. I remember when I was a teenager, uh, my mother always asked, "Where are you?" when I called. Or we didn't have cell phones at the time. "Where are you? Where are you?" So it was the very first question. And so uh, this inability to locate the loved one is very scary. It's very disorienting. Depending on how death happened, making sense of it might take more or less time. Some describe loss as a void that cannot be filled. I relate to that description, especially in the initial stage of grief. The void and the absence may feel as deeply disorienting silence at first. I would love to reflect on the shock stage for a moment. Loss feels like a shock, and it is a shock. Grieving is navigating a shock and my own sense of being lost. Loss of identity attached to that particular relationship, loss of the unique way I experience life within the bubble of that relationship. It feels like that bubble has bursted and is gone forever. Loss of futuristic memory, not able to project a future with that person. The me in that future seems lost. And it takes time for the system to integrate the reality of loss. I often forgot my father was dead, and I had this impulse to call him as we spoke very often, and then suddenly I remembered. And each time I re-experienced the shock and that heavy void of loss. I thought about how I can describe this void of loss as it is very important. Many years ago, I was invited to a very interesting event in Istanbul. A prostitute was going to tell her life story in complete darkness. The venue was underground, completely dark. The waiters were blind, and there were live musicians in the venue. And to go in, we touched the person's shoulder in front of us so we could be led to our table. Otherwise, we would be lost. They told us, don't let the person go because then you're lost. You can't find your place. And this was extremely scary for me. I could not be in that full darkness. So I escaped. I listened to the program sitting next to the door on a stool where I could have some light coming under the door. So when I experienced the loss of my father, the void initially felt like that darkness. But I wasn't in a venue. I felt like I was in a black hole, and this black hole was all over, but this time I couldn't escape it. Why is that void so important? Because it invites the therapy process. In that void, I am a human being grieving. The void is almost like a womb where the grief process unfolds over time. I had many questions, and the questions evolved as time passed. For example, questions right after the shock. I had the image of yelling into this black hole, and I kept asking, what happened? How did this happen? What happened? Now you don't exist. I talked to you 10 hours ago. Now you don't exist. I can't locate you. Where are you? Where is he? What's your address? What's your new address? There's no phone line. There's no way I can find you in the whole universe, even beyond this universe. It is so difficult to grasp. Can you still hear me, see me, sense me? Then questions after a month, they were slightly different, still yelling into the hole, but they had a different intensity. Why do we have to go through this? We love to lose? Why? What kind of system is this? Why is it so cruel? And then I would think, is it cruel? What am I missing? I must be missing something. And so I had a lot of questions like that. And of course, I didn't receive any answers. There was silence. Well, the answers arrived slowly, I have to say. Maybe not to those questions, but there were answers. I realized that it's important to keep asking, to continue asking. So I mentioned the 3 stages: shock, surrender, and solace. My transition from shock into surrender happened in a dream. I dreamt of my father for the first time about a month after his death, and I heard his voice saying in the dream, "Hazal, it's okay to cry. You can cry." And I remember in the dream, I put my face on the earth and cried. I believe that is when I left the shock stage and transitioned into surrendering. I describe surrendering as, yes, this is real. This happened. I am so sad. Help. As I cried, I felt the deep pain that only the soil seemed to solace. One day, I began singing into this void. Then I began to play an instrument. Then I began to play another instrument. Then I started playing with rhythm. I found the rhythm of grief very slow, very different than the speed of email, social media, or text messages. I wanted to find the right images to show me what I'm experiencing. So I needed to make my experience visible to me. That's why I also needed to do some videos, because I had to see. That way I was hoping I wouldn't be so lost. And this is what I did. At this point, I thought it might be useful to talk a little bit about neuroscience and attachment. The emotional part of the brain, as you know, is connected with our attachment circuitry. And attachment wiring is connected to the subcortical survival system. As children, before we develop language, we operate somatically and emotionally. We cry, we feel pain, we cry, we laugh, we reach out. With time, as the left brain and the prefrontal cortex develop, our capacity for complex thinking also develops and enhances. We start speaking, we start conversing with words, and it's an ongoing developmental process. So to a child, attachment is survival. Any danger to the attachment relationship feels like the possibility of death. As children, we fear the death of our parents. If they die, we will die. Some of us go through physically losing parents at a very young age, and some of us struggle with emotional disconnection, which can feel like death as well. Survival is a primary concern from birth on, and this is implicitly connected to our attachment to our caregivers. So, death of a loved one where there is strong attachment has a shocking impact on the way we organize reality, no matter how old we are, because it touches a very basic place in us. It's a pre-verbal place. During the shock, the primitive survival brain is more activated, thinking clearly is compromised, time is reversed, time stops, time fast forwards. It's like an earthquake hits the system. We need to reorient, we need to restructure, even rebuild. And in this time of reorienting, adults have more capacity to create resources while children need the adults to access resources. When we are in shock, nervous system is overwhelmed. Life energy can get stuck in two directions: constant high activation or low activation. That's why during the grief process, it's very common that people feel anxiety or depression. Part of grieving is continuously reintroducing the nervous system and the emotional system back to the safety zone. And when there's enough safety, then spontaneity and creativity spring from the impulsive, irrational, nonlinear parts of the brain. And as artists, that's the part we want to access, right? So as actors, we improvise and we want to be able to reach that spontaneous part, or we study an instrument over and over again so that we could improvise. When there's enough safety, there is playfulness. And there is spontaneity. And as the artist makes contact with rich emotional material, the analytical brain can act as a helper. So I can say, oh, I will use now this sound. I will use this instrument. I will use this note. I will use this color. I'm going to make a video using these photos or these clips. So both parts of the brain are aligned in processing and transforming pain. It's like they're now a team. And we're engaged in creating an aesthetic reality that can hold pain. When we make art, we transform shock by the process of creativity. Art making is a wonderful container that induces safety to the system. And this is exactly what I experienced. And I didn't experience it just alone. I collaborated in this process with live musicians and also with some friends, and also with a family member, my sister. We shared many conversations because we were both grieving, but we also shared in art making. I arranged and sang music, and she choreographed and danced. Here's one example of a piece that was composed by my grandfather about 50 or 60 years ago.
Gittin de bıraktın beni aylarca kederde mehtap oluyordun bana aysız gecelerde mehtap oluyordun bana aysız gecelerde. Aysız gecelerde mehtap oluyordun bana aysız gecelerde.
How does art making induce safety? I want to talk a little more about that. The art form contains and guides the emotional experience in a safe way. Slowing down helps us to listen to, titrate, and integrate our experience. going back, trying again and again. That way I'm able to process painful material in small amounts. I go, oh, let me go to this section of this song. I want to choose this word, not that word. Okay, I want to choose this chord. Oh, let's add a major seventh. No, not major seventh. Let's try this. So that is actually a wonderful way of digesting the experience. It's titration. And to be met by the music or the art form, the pain is contained and with time it is transformed, but you have to come back to it. That's the thing. I think that makes the art process maybe a little more difficult because it needs consistency. I at least couldn't do it in a day. I couldn't arrange a song in a day, or I couldn't compose a song in a day. I had to come back to it over and over again. And there's another component: to be met by myself. I witness myself creating. So the observer is awake. I'm not lost in the emotion. I'm present. I'm present somatically, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, to myself and to something larger than myself. I'm present to the art process, to the art piece that's being developed, but also to something larger than that even. And then sharing the artwork is the natural evolution of the process. It invites more connection, even if it's just one audience. In my process of art making, I didn't have a therapist who guided me, so I was both the therapist and the client. But I shared it with friends. I shared it with people. I shared it on social media. So, but this is regardless of the artwork being professional or not. It's about the process, not the product, but sharing it, having some witnesses adds to it, adds to the transformation. Grieving is a space for consolidation and reconnection. It is a process of reintegrating left and right sides of the brain and inviting in more regulation. Grieving is learning to contain the sensations of helplessness. Grieving is also a process of conversation with death. So my questions after 4 months were as follows. Have you met loved ones over there? Will we meet again? Did you want to go? Do you miss us? In the initial stages of grieving, sharing with loved ones who related to the grief was very soothing to me. Sharing pain in talk therapy and with loved ones helped me transition from shock to surrender. I mean, my final transition was in the dream, but sharing pain with loved ones and also in talk therapy was definitely a preparation for that. Connection and conversation activated social engagement, thus increased a sense of safety. Loved ones who were not actively grieving, but who empathized and offered their presence, helped me further regulate and rebuild a sense of safety. So I would say that both talk therapy and art making have a lot to offer. Therapy using the arts and talk therapy, they both have a lot to offer. Talk therapy offers a linear way to process pain, get feedback, a caring person's voice, face, understanding, perspective, empathy. But after 3 months, I no longer wanted to do talk therapy. Talking about death or my pain was no longer necessary. It was a choice. I wanted to surrender to art making. I was making music and doing therapy, but at some point I just wanted to stay with the art making. I experienced during this process of art making, like I said, being both therapist and client. And art making started feeling like a deeper way to process my pain. And I wasn't the only therapist. The art form was a therapist as well. And art making was the therapeutic process. I found that relationship, my relationship to the piece that's evolving, my relationship to myself, my relationship to something larger than myself, my relationship to other musicians, to people I'm collaborating with, I found that very mysterious and aesthetically, relationally, much more pleasing to me. Being able to witness transformation in metaphors, in sounds, lyrics, colors, scenes when I did the videos, all these dimensions were healing to my system. And art making was available to me 24/7, so I could do it whenever I wanted. And as I surrendered, I found the process of grieving extremely mysterious, even surprising. People I hadn't seen in a very long time reached out. I started rekindling some lost relationships in a new way. As I thought of my father, I would receive an email or a recording someone they had done years ago, letters that my father wrote. People emailed them to me, or postcards my father wrote to me 40 years ago started to appear. So it was very beautiful, actually. And I also connected to grief about other losses that I experienced, loss of friends, other family members, particularly my grandmother, my father's mother. So I started grieving her as well. That came back. So the silence of death slowly gave birth to a stream of connections from the past, rich memories, and to more music. And the void was no longer a black hole. Here's another example.
Hatırlamaz Mesud'u, sen de ben gibi yan. Tuluğa bak, beni yad et, gruba bak, beni an. Hatırlamaz Mesud'u, sen de ben gibi yan. Tuluğa bak, beni yad et, gruba bak, beni an. Unutmadım seni ömrümde, bir dakika inan. Tuluğa bak, beni yad et, gruba bak, beni an. Zemini türlü çiçeklerle süsledikçe bak beni an, tuluğa bak beni yad et, gruba bak beni an.
Throughout the years, I had made music with my father only through singing. I had never composed or arranged music before. The irresistible urge to compose music was new. I was very surprised by myself. The more I surrendered to death and to this void through music, the more alive I felt. And I met an aspect of myself that I did not know existed. Now, after 14 months of my father's death, having completed 12 songs, I can say that this silence of death and void have been a mysterious path into creativity and reconnection with myself, with others, with life, and also with death. And my father is present in all of this. At times, it seems as full as his worldly presence.
Yürüyorum bir ileri, yürüyorum sonra geri, yürüyorum bir ileri iki geri, sonra yine ileri. Yürüyorum dans ederek daireler içinde, yürüyorum düşerek güneşin ellerine, kıvrılan yollardan dağları aşarak, perdeler açarak yürüyorum. Su altı üzerinde bir rüya eteğine dokunarak yürüyorum. Dans eder gibi, çizer gibi, söyler gibi, duyar gibi, görür gibi, tadar gibi, yürüyorum, anlar gibi. Yürüyorum bir ileri, yürüyorum sonra geri, yürüyorum bir ileri iki geri, sonra yine ileri. Yürüyorum dans ederek daireler içinde, yürüyorum düşerek güneşin ellerine, kıvrılan yollardan dağları aşarak, perdeler açarak yürüyorum. Su altı üzerinde bir rüya eteğine dokunarak yürüyorum. Dans eder gibi, çizer gibi, söyler gibi, duyar gibi, görür gibi, tadar gibi, yürüyorum, anlar gibi. Yürüyorum bilinmeyene, bir şarkısı olur diye. Yürüyorum düşerek, yürüyorum kaybederek, yürüyorum görerek, yürüyorum sabrederek, yürüyorum severek, yürüyorum özleyerek, yürüyorum hayal gibi.
I believe there's no how to grieve perfectly recipe. Uh, there are no steps from 1 to 5. So by the end of the 5th step, I'm all grieved out. The only way for me personally, artistically, and professionally has been increasing my capacity to listen and wait for what wants to happen next. Grief is being able to both follow and redirect life energy in a system that is experiencing a severe shock. The right question for me has been, is it safe to follow my heart and body? Am I safe enough to be with this absence, this void, even though at times it can seem soundless, endless, and very dark? I found that as I got connected to the emotions that result out of absence, there was increased settling and quietness. Grieving itself is solace. Solace brings soothing depth.
Yine bir gül yüzlü aldı bu gönlümü. Yine bir gül yüzlü aldı bu gönlümü. İpekten gonca dudak dilerim benim olacak. İpekten gonca dudak dilerim benim olacak. Ruhunun ateşi yaktı bu gönlümü. Ruhunun ateşi dinleyenler bu halim ne olacak? Şarkımı dinleyenler bu halim ne olacak? Pek yatan, pek nazlı, pek şirin, pek güzel, pek yaman, pek nazlı, pek şirin, pek güzel.
Pendulation refers to moving between painful content and healing resources. Memories, anniversaries, people, smells, sounds trigger intense emotions during grief process. And grieving is the practice of enhancing capacity for listening, being with these intense waves of emotions. And it is also redirecting attention to both soothing and energizing resources. Art making encompasses both. It soothes and energizes while holding the pain. It fosters pendulation in an organic way. I mentioned a lot this word listening, and I think probably it's one of the most important ingredients in the grief process. So I just wanted to break it down a little more. So I ended up with this list. Maybe there's more, but I could come up with these: somatic listening, emotional listening, listening to nature, spiritual listening, artistic listening, and listening as a therapist. So I will go through each briefly. Somatic listening, what do I mean by that? It's noticing pain, noticing pleasure, noticing tiredness, relaxation, noticing tightness, sense of lightness, heaviness, but also sense of being alive, being energized, containing sensations such as my heart is heavy, following impulses, I need to reach out, I need a massage, I need to rest, I need to sing, I need to work. Even though during the pandemic, there was no massage opportunity, but definitely I had the impulse. And then spiritual listening, recognizing synchronistic events. I think of someone and then they write to me. I ask for help, something happens synchronistically. Finding helpful books, finding helpful videos, reading or hearing words that are soothing. Somebody passes by on the street and they say something, and then that's actually very soothing. And deepening spiritual practice, connection to something larger, and trusting the process. When it comes to artistic listening, listening to what wants to express itself, making space for creatively processing intense feelings and thoughts, using the art form as the safe space. Listening to nature, I found, was also extremely soothing to me. Pain waxes and wanes in the grief process. It's like ocean tides, like the crescent moon becoming full and getting small again. Seasons model natural cycle over and over again. Listening to the relationship between fall leaves and spring flowers. I also found solace in listening to birds. Emotional listening, I call it the river of emotions: sadness, anger, relief, guilt, resentment, joy, peace. And listening and solidifying the internalized representation of the loved one. How does the loved one talk within me to me? And finally, listening as a therapist. I was so grateful that actually I was a therapist during my grief process, because attending to clients made the grief process easier for me, redirecting my attention to something meaningful. Before my father's death, I worked with a mother who lost 3 children to a car accident. She was a client of mine, and she lost 3 children. I remember being afraid of the grief process and sought supervision to help myself be with grief. I didn't know how I could make space for this tragedy. I was afraid, and I did not trust my capacity to be with the intensity. And eventually, I gave her the option to go to a grief expert. A year after my father's death, a couple I worked with had multiple losses in a very short time. And sitting with them through their grief was a totally different experience. I noticed the ease I had in the grief space. I was able to trust the process itself. The couple went through multiple explorations around death. They talked about their own death, losing each other, and what that would be like. They cried, mourned the losses they had, and eventually they landed on 2 words: love and humanness. They said that going through grief and death, the concept of death, connected them to more love and humanness.
Nasıl üflüyor nefesini rüzgar, dinle. Bırakıyor son yaprağı ıhlamur, dinle. Uzaklar kavuşmuş, dinle. Yeni bir mevsim kapıda, gözlerine dolansın rüyası. Allı beyaz kınalı, dinle. Nasıl akıyor usulca zaman, dinle. Taşınıyor tüm anılar sırtında, dinle. Nereye koşuyor, dinle. Yeni bir mevsim kapıda, kollarına dolansın rüyası. Allı beyaz kınalı, dinle. Nasıl doğuyor yeniden umut, dinle. Islanıyor kirpikleri yağmurda, dinle. Her damla bir müjde, dinle. Yeni bir mevsim kapıda, yüreğine dolansın rüyası. Allı beyaz kınalı, dinle. Bir gelecek uzanmış serin toprağa, çözülmeyi bekleyen sihirli bir bilmece gibi.
How long does grief last? I want to share a quote, an inspiring quote, to answer that question. Healthy process of grief involves continuing bonds that survivors maintain with the deceased. Integration is an ongoing process. The relationships with loved ones endure. That is normal and expected. There is no time limit on sacred bonds. And where to move forward? Greater consciousness is the gift of death to the living who remain behind. Another very inspiring quote to me. Grief brought out in me what was best in my father and in my relationship with him. That has been one way I keep him alive for, I can keep him alive for as long as I live. The relationship still continues, whether I make music or not, it will continue. My father lives through me. As I grow, aspects of him that live in me will continue to grow as well. And I was lucky enough that my father was an artist, and so am I. This had shown me the power of art making in living and in death and grieving. I'm going to say this sentence again. This had shown me the power of art making in living and in death and grieving. And before I finish, I want to briefly touch on this fear of death. We don't know how to deal with death. Most of us are afraid of it. We don't talk about it unless we experience some intense event. And we don't have a class around navigating death, like Death 101. In my freshman year, I'd like to, as an elective, I'd like to learn more about death. That doesn't exist. At least, I don't know, maybe it does, but I haven't encountered it. So we don't talk much about what death means, what death is. Even in the trauma language, we talk about fight, flight, freeze as survival responses. You survived, you made it, victory. I understand from the perspective of shock trauma, we look at death as loss versus victory. And every culture, community, religion, and spiritual practice has its own coping strategies when it comes to loss and grief. And that is beyond the scope of this presentation. I have been interested in exploring how individuals relate to grief by taking their own heart, mind, and body as a reference. And that is how I approached my own grief process. In my culture, the Sufi tradition talks about death differently. It views death as the wedding day with the beloved. I'm sure there are other cultures that celebrate death. Personally, I'm not there yet. But as a result of this grief process, I have come to find death extremely rich and mysterious. After a year, here are more questions. Where did I come from? How long do I have? When will I leave? How will I leave? Where do I go to? And until then, how can I serve to my best ability? This last song was the very last song I composed, arranged, I wrote the lyrics and sang, but I haven't made the video yet. So I still wanted to share the song. So here it is. Thank you for listening.
Adam sordu toprağa, hayatın anlamı ne? Bunca yıl, bunca zahmet, bir anlamı var elbet. Kadın sordu toprağa, doğumun anlamı ne? Ölüm varsa sonunda bu sancılar ne diye? Söyle bana, ölenler de özler mi? Sessiz olsam duyar mıyım sesini? Nereden geldim? Ne kadar zamanım var? Nasıl giderim? Yolculuk nereye kadar? Bu sorular sordukça çoğalırlar. Getirmez gideni nereye aydınlatırlar? Sırayla sor soruları, cevapları bekle gelsin. Yalnız sana bir tavsiye, çok düşünüp üşütmeyesin. Sakın, aman aman sakın. Ölüm bir sır, yaşam karışık. Ölüm bir sır, yaşam karışık. Her şey ne açık, oy oy oy oy. Ölüm kolay, yaşamak zor. Ölüm kolay, yaşamak zor. Her şey ne açık, oy oy oy oy. Sözümü iyi dinle. Ölüm bir sır, yaşam mucize. Adam sordu toprağa, pişmanlığın anlamı ne? Bunca yıl, bunca zahmet, geç kalmışsan ne demek? Kadın sordu toprağa, doğumun anlamı ne? Özlem varsa sonunda bu sancılar ne diye? Söyle bana, ölenler de özler mi? Sessiz olsam duyar mıyım sesini? Sırayla sor soruları, cevapları bekle gelsin. Yalnız sana bir tavsiye, çok düşünüp üşütmeyesin. Aman sakın, aman sakın. Yıkmak kolay, yaşatmak zor. Yakmak kolay, yeşertmek zor. Her şey ne açık, oy oy oy oy. Sövmek kolay, anlamak zor. Sevmek kolay, unutmak zor. Her şey ne açık, oy oy oy oy. Sözümü iyi dinle. Ölüm bir sır, yaşam mucize. Dikkat dikkat, kaçırma çok iyi bak. Aman dikkat, önce kaldır başını. Bu sorular sordukça çoğalırlar. Uzat elini, artık bırak tasayı. Tut elimi, koy kalbine, bitir ölüm yasını. Dikkat dikkat, kaçırma çok iyi bak. Aman dikkat, önce kaldır başını. Bu sorular sordukça çoğalırlar. Uzat elini, artık bırak tasayı. başla.